At home, we have this big trunk, and inside the trunk are letters and letters and letters that Susan and I exchanged when we were in university. She was in Oklahoma. I was in Ottawa. We didn't have a platonic relationship. We had a plutonic relationship because she may as well have been in Pluto because she was that far away. And so what we did was we wrote all of these letters. And I will tell you that if I had spent as much time on my studies as I did writing letters to that redhead in Oklahoma, I would have graduated at the top of my class, which, by the way, I did not even close. But maybe you've got some letters like that, letters that are meaningful to you because of who wrote them and the quality of the relationship that you had with that person. Maybe somebody wrote something about you or for you at one point in your life, and you kept that because it was insanely important to you. I think that that's exactly what was happening with this letter that Paul writes to the Philippians. He obviously loves these people. He cares about them in a very powerful way. This letter is powerful, it's compelling, and it's intensely personal because he does have deep feelings for these people. Now, this church in Greece was exceptional in many ways. They stood by him through thick and thin. And as we go through this study, what you're going to see is that he hits these major themes that he really wants them to know and understand. But more than that, he wants to convey how much he loves them, how much he cares for them, and why they're important to him. And because we're going to spend some time picking this letter apart, I thought it might be important for us to look at the overview. So what we're going to start with is a video that will give you an idea as to what this letter is all about, why Paul writes it, who he writes it to, and what it's all about. This, by the way, is from a group called the Bible Project. And if you're not familiar with this group, what it does is a series of explainer videos like the one you're about to see, and it uses a very different technique. And if you like this technique, you might want to check out their other materials because they're just wonderful with what they do. This, in essence, then, is the book of Philippians.
Paul's letter to the Philippians. The church in Philippi was the first Jesus community Paul started in Eastern Europe, and that story is told in Acts chapter 16. Philippi was a Roman colony in ancient Macedonia. It was full of retired soldiers, and it was known for its patriotic nationalism. And so there, Paul faced resistance when he was announcing Jesus as the true king of the world. And after Paul moved on from there, those who became followers of Jesus continued to suffer resistance and even persecution, but they remained a vibrant community faithful to the way of Jesus. Paul sent this letter from one of his many imprisonments, and for a very practical reason. The Philippians had sent one of their members, Epaphroditus, to take a financial gift to Paul to support him in prison. And Paul sent back this letter with Epaphroditus to say thank you and to do a whole lot more. The design of this letter doesn't develop one single idea from beginning to end like many of Paul's other letters. Rather, Paul has arranged a series of short, reflective essays or vignettes, and they all revolve around the center of gravity in this letter, which is a poem in chapter 2. It artistically retells the story of the Messiah's incarnation, his life, death, and resurrection, and exaltation. And then in each of these vignettes, Paul will take up key words or ideas from that poem to show how living as a Christian means seeing your own story as a lived expression of Jesus' story. So Paul opens the letter with a prayer of gratefulness, and he thanks God for the Philippians' generosity, for their faithfulness, and he expresses his confidence that the life-transforming work that God has begun in them will continue into greater and more beautiful expressions of faithfulness and love. And Paul then focuses on their obvious concern at the moment, which is his status in prison. Being in a Roman prison was no picnic, but it paradoxically has turned out for good to advance the good news about Jesus. So all of the Roman guards, the administrators, they all know that Paul's in prison for announcing Jesus as the risen Lord. And his imprisonment, it's inspired confidence in other Christians to talk about Jesus more openly. And Paul's optimistic that he will be released from prison, but it's possible that he could be executed. And as he reflects on it, that actually wouldn't be so bad, because for me, Paul says, life is the Messiah. And so dying would be a gain. For Paul, his life in the present and in the future, it's defined by the life and love of Jesus for him. And so if he's executed, That means he'll be present with Jesus, which would be great for him. And if he's released, well, that would mean he could keep working to start more Jesus communities, which would be better for other people. And so that's what he hopes for. And notice how his train of thought works here. Dying for Jesus is not the true sacrifice for Paul. Rather, it's staying alive to serve others. And so that's Paul's way of participating in the story of Jesus, to suffer in order to love others more than himself. Paul then turns to the Philippians, and he urges them to participate in Jesus' example by taking up this same mindset. He says, your life as citizens should be consistent with the good news about the Messiah. So these Christians in Philippi, they were living in a hotbed of Roman patriotism, but their way of life was to be shaped by another king, Jesus. And that might bring persecution, but they are not to be afraid, because suffering for being associated with Jesus, it's a way of living out the story of Jesus himself. Which leads Paul into the great poem of chapter 2. It's rich with echoes of Old Testament texts, specifically the story of Adam and his rebellion in Genesis 1 through 3, and the poems about the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah. This poem is worth committing to memory. It is a beautifully condensed version of the gospel story. So before becoming human, the Messiah pre-existed in a state of glory and equality with God. And unlike Adam, who tried to seize equality with God, the Messiah chose not to exploit his equal status for his self-advantage. Rather, he emptied himself of status. He became a human. He became a servant to all. And even more than that, he allowed himself to be humiliated. He was obedient to the Father by going to his death on a Roman execution rack. But through God's power and grace, the Messiah's shameful death has been reversed through the resurrection. And now God has highly exalted Jesus as the King of all, bestowing upon him the name that is above all names, so that all creation should recognize that Jesus the Messiah is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now that last statement is astounding. Paul's quoting from Isaiah chapter 45. It's a passage where all creation comes to recognize the God of Israel as Lord. Paul's point here is very clear. In the crucified and risen Jesus, we discover that the one true God of Israel consists of God the Father and the Lord Jesus. And so for Paul, this poem, it expresses his convictions about who Jesus is, and it does more. It offers the example of Jesus as a way of life that his followers are to imitate. And so that's why Paul immediately goes on to tell two stories. First about Timothy, then about Epaphroditus, because they are both examples of people living out Jesus' story. So Timothy's like Jesus because he's constantly concerned for the well-being of other people more than his own. And Epaphroditus, who the Philippians sent with their gift, he ended up risking his life to serve Paul in prison. He got so sick he almost died trying to help Paul. But God had mercy on him and Paul by sparing him the loss of a friend. Paul's point here is that these are the kinds of people who are living, breathing examples of the story of Jesus, and they are worthy of imitation. Paul then turns to his own story as an example. So those Christians who had been demanding circumcision of non-Jewish Christians, remember his letter to the Galatians, these people are still stirring up trouble for Paul, and they keep reminding him of his own past, when he used to persecute Jesus' followers, when he tried to show his right standing before God by his zealous obedience to the laws of the Torah. But like Jesus, Paul has given up all of that status and privilege. He now regards all of it as filth, and the word he uses is actually much less polite. He's given it all up to become a servant, like Jesus, to participate in his suffering and sacrificial love. And he does all of it in the hope that Jesus' love will carry him through death and out the other side into resurrection. So Paul says that for followers of Jesus, their true citizenship is in heaven, which for Paul does not mean that we should all hope to get away from earth and go to heaven one day. Rather, heaven is the transcendent place where Jesus reigns as king. And he says we're eagerly awaiting our royal Savior to come from there and return here to bring his kingdom of healing justice and transforming love to bring about a new creation. Paul then challenges the Philippians to keep living out the Jesus story. He first addresses two prominent women leaders in the church who worked alongside Paul, and they're in some kind of conflict. And so Paul pleads with them to follow Jesus' example of humility, to reconcile and become unified. Paul then urges the Philippians not to give in to fear, but despite their persecution, to vent all of their emotion and their needs to God, who will give them peace. And that peace, Paul says, it comes by focusing your thoughts on what is good and true and lovely. There's always something that you could complain about, but a follower of Jesus knows that all of life is a gift and can choose to see beauty and grace in any life circumstance. Which leads Paul to his conclusion. He again thanks the Philippians for their sacrificial gift, and he wants them to know that his imprisonments, that his times of poverty, that these are not true hardships for him. They've actually become his greatest teachers, showing him that no matter his circumstances, he has learned the secret of contentment. It's simple dependence on the one who strengthens him. Paul has come to see his own suffering as a participation in the story of Jesus. The letter to the Philippians gives us a unique window into Paul's own heart and mind. He saw his entire life as a reenactment of the story of Jesus. And you can sense in this letter his close connection to Jesus, his awareness that Jesus' love and presence is closer than his own skin. And that's what gave him hope and humility in his darkest hours. And so Paul shows us that knowing Jesus is always a deeply personal, transforming encounter. And that's the kind of Jesus that Paul invites others to follow. And that's what Paul's letter to the Philippians is all about.
What I hope you got out of that overview is the sense that your life needs to be a living, breathing example and reflection of the life of Jesus. When people look at you, they should see Jesus. That's essentially what it's all about. And Paul begins this whole letter with something that kind of gives us a glimpse into his heart. He says, I'm writing to all of God's holy people in Brantford who belong to Christ Jesus. Yes, really, that's true. He is writing to us. He is writing to the Philippians, but this is about us. And one of the things I love about Philippians is that this church really reminds me of followers. You see all kinds of affection in what he says here. Every time I think of you, he says, I give thanks to my God. Every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. Whenever I pray, I make my request for all of you with joy. For you have been my partners in spreading the good news about Christianity from the time you first heard about it until now. And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day when Jesus Christ returns. I really love that phrase. God, who began a good work in you, will make sure that that ends in fruition, in joy, in purpose, and in love. Because whatever God starts, he's going to finish. And one of the reasons why Paul loves these people so much is because they are living out the love and the joy and the hope that they find in Jesus. And if this church is not a reflection of that, then we're in trouble. Because one of the things that he's going to go on to say here is that we need to make sure that we allow God to finish in our lives what he has started in each of us and in our life together. We need to be, as he goes on to say, defending and confirming the truth of the good news. That's what he commends the Philippians for. They are defending the story of Jesus. They are confirming the story of Jesus by the way that they talk and the way that they live. And that needs to be the case with us too. He says, I pray that your love will overflow more and more and that you will keep on growing in knowledge and understanding. Listen up. For I want you to understand what really matters, so that you may live pure and blameless lives until the day of Christ's return. May you always be filled with the fruit of your salvation, the righteous character produced in your life by Christ Jesus, for this will bring much glory and praise to you. No, it will bring much glory and praise to God. That's what this is all about. The full expression of your life needs to reflect Jesus Christ. And if it does, and when it does, it will bring much glory and honor to God. That's what we're supposed to be about. Now, did you notice here that one of the things he says is, I want you to understand what really matters so you will live pure and blameless lives. In other words, if you want to live a life of love, a life of service, you have to put first things first. So let me tell you a story. I remember being in master control one day at CTV. Master control was upstairs from the newsroom. It's the place where all the news feeds were coming in from all over the world. And there was a gaggle of people around one of the consoles as they watched this feed come in, and there was a really tense discussion underway. I couldn't figure out what was going on, so because it seemed so strange, I went over to have a look. And they were gathered around watching a story that had just come in about a videographer whose name was Ivan McGuire. He was a veteran jumper, and he was employed as a videographer with a parachuting company. His job was to record the jumps of all the people who came through so that they could sell the tape to them after. Well, on this particular day in 1988, beautiful April morning, Ivan did what he always did. He got his gear together, he jumped out of the plane first so he could record the moment. And you see the tape rolling, and you can tell the exact moment when Ivan McGuire realizes he's in big trouble. He had jumped out of the airplane after fiddling with the camera without putting his parachute on, and he plunged to his death. Now look, that is a good metaphor for what happens in our lives so often. We get so distracted by the things around us, the things that other people are doing, the responsibilities that we have, and sometimes we forget the things that are most important, the things of first importance. And it's so easy for us to fall into that trap because we are surrounded by competing agendas, people who are telling us different things about how to be different and how to be happy and how to find fulfillment. And if we listen to the wrong voices, if we get caught up in the wrong things, we're never going to be able to reach that place where we are reflecting Jesus and living those pure and blameless lives that Paul is talking about here. So my question for you today is, what is it that makes us lose sight of the most important things, which, as Herb brought to us earlier, have to do with things like love and mercy and service to others? What gets in the way? Tell me. Distraction is the enemy. Distraction is the enemy. Because the more that we get caught up in the values and the priorities of this life, the more we lose sight of the things that Jesus calls us to. And the truth is that Don is right. We're always going to have people who need a little bit of us. They're going to make demands on our time and on our energy and even on our loyalty. And sometimes unwittingly and sometimes subtly acknowledging what's going on, we give those things away, knowing that we're not doing what we need to do. And so we have to be very careful that when we're living our lives, that we're doing it with intention. We're doing it having reflected on who we are, why we're here, and where we're going. You know, I love the story about Jack Phillips. Maybe you've heard that name before, but probably not. Jack was the chief telegraphist on the Titanic. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but when that ship went down, it had been warned 6 times about icebergs in the area. The problem was that telegraphy was a relatively new technology, and they were sort of overwhelmed by all of these messages that were flying all over the place. At one point, the USS Californian telegraphs the Titanic and says, "You are very close to icebergs." Jack Phillips wires back, "Shut up, I'm busy." And look what happened. All those people lost their lives because this man was so harried and so hurried that he lost sight of what was truly important. And I think that that's often the way it works with us too. If you are so busy that you don't have time to think, you don't have time to pray, you don't have time to give other people in your life what they need, then you're just too busy. Because distraction will take you away from God in subtle ways that you don't even realize are happening at the time. We can have this life of love that the Philippians are commended for, or we can have this life where we are totally distracted and we are totally dismayed by what's going on around us, but we cannot have them both. And I think we really need to practice what Paul says here. He says you need to know what really matters. You need to know what really matters. If you look at the writings of Paul in the New Testament, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, what's most important to him is the resurrection. Jesus says what's most important to him is
Love.
Yeah, love. Jesus said, you've got to love God with all you are. You've got to love others with everything you have. And you need to build your life around Jesus Christ. That's what the focused life is all about. Generally speaking, we don't get to deflect and to blame everybody else for the way we're living, because we get to make those choices, don't we? Nobody forces us to do what you do. Nobody forces me to do what I do. Read across something a little sobering a little while ago. It said, as you spend your days, so you spend your life. Now, we don't often stop and think about that, but the way you spend every day, well, those days are going to add up. And before you know it, you're down the pike a lot further and a lot faster than you bargained on. And so the way you spend every day is probably going to characterize how you live your life as a whole. So we need to make sure that we have the right priorities, because the whole idea here, as Paul says, is that we need to be filled with the fruit of our salvation. In other words, the righteous character produced in our lives by what we believe about Jesus. And if we believe he's the Christ, if we believe he's coming back to get us, if we believe that he is our way into the presence of God for eternity, then that's going to determine the way we live, how we spend our money, how we spend our time, where we give our attention, and what our values are. Because that's what determines what's important in the way that we spend our daily lives. Your values and your priorities are everything. And if they happen to be wrong, they're going to really lead us astray. That's just the way it is. And I think we have a tendency to think that, well, when things are going well, then I can really glorify God in my life. And what Paul says, building on what he's experiencing in that Roman jail, what Paul says is you can glorify God no matter what's going on in your life. He says, I'm in chains. Everybody knows I'm in chains because of Christ and because of my imprisonment. Most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak of God's message without fear. So what's happening here? Well, people are looking at how Paul is experiencing this imprisonment. Paul is a reflection of Jesus. People can see that, and so they are inspired, they are encouraged, they are willing to follow suit. And if we exhibit the kind of feelings and the kind of attitudes that Jesus wants us to have when you go through the furnace, when you're in the fires, people can be and will be inspired by that if you're following your God. It's not just the good times that glorify God, it's how we respond in the bad times that are the true measure of who we are and what's really going on in our hearts. He says everything is possible. I remember the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and many of you will know him. He was a very well-known and important Christian during World War II. He spoke out against the Nazis. He suffered for his faith. He was imprisoned by the Germans. And the story is told that they had to keep changing the Nazi guards surrounding Bonhoeffer every couple of days because he was such a powerful witness for God that these men kept getting converted. And this disturbed the commanders to the point where they just had to continually circle through all these different people to make sure that Bonhoeffer wasn't having that kind of an effect. Can you imagine? Can you imagine people looking at your life, seeing something distinctive and different, something special, and being so intrigued by that that they want to know where this is coming from? That's what we're called to do. That's what we're called to be. And that's sometimes what happens, but sometimes not so much. Paul says, I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or die. For to me, living means living for Christ, and dying is even better. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me. But for your sakes, it's better that I continue to live. Wow, wouldn't that be wonderful if you could step back and you could look at your life and say, it's a win-win situation no matter what happens. Because if I stay here, then I have a purpose. God has a plan for me. There's a reason that I'm here, and I need to fulfill that to the best of my ability. And if I get sick, or if I die, then all that means is that I get to be with Jesus. Really, that's supposed to be the thing that we live for anyway. Paul says, either way, he's good. He's torn between these two desires, but no matter how it works out, he's good. You know how he does that? He kind of gives us a clue a little later in the first chapter. He says, above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a worthy manner of the good news about Christ. That was Paul's secret. Paul did not live as a citizen of Rome. He lived as a citizen of heaven. That influenced everything that he thought and all that he did, and it will be the same with us. In Colossians chapter 3, Paul writes, don't just think about the things of earth, think also about heaven, where your real life is. This is a reasonable facsimile, but it's not your real life. Our real life is later. And again, that doesn't mean that we need to be anxious to get out of here or that we can just ignore all the responsibilities we have while we're here. But what he's saying is, don't get so comfortable, don't get so complacent that you forget who you are and why it is that you're here in the first place. Because the whole purpose of life is to equip us and to train us and to prove us, to mature us so that we can be direct representatives of Jesus in a meaningful way that will draw others to him. Because when we go, we want to take some people with us. That's what it's all about. Above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourself in a worthy manner of the good news. Can you say that? Can people say that about you? When they look at your life, can they say, look at him. He's a living, breathing expression of Jesus Christ. Look at her. She is the full expression of the gospel, this idea of love and transformation and peace. Those are the things that we are called to. Those are the things that need to be part of our thinking. And he concludes the first chapter by saying, we are in this struggle together. You've seen my struggle in the past, and you know that I'm still in the midst of it. You can say that, can't you? You know my past. You know my life. You can see where I am. And you know that I've struggled to be faithful. You know that I'm still struggling to be faithful. But we're in this together. And that's why I hope you're here today, to be reminded that you have an identity, you have a purpose, and you have a destination. I hope you're here today to be reminded that we have an obligation to one another, to strengthen and to encourage and to help one another along the journey. Because we're on a pilgrimage. We're on a pilgrimage to heaven. And if we're going to make that trip, we have to make it together. And I think that Paul is a little concerned here. He says, I've been bold in the past, but he says, I want you to pray for me that I'll continue to be bold. That I'll continue to be bold. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or die. I think he knows that even he is vulnerable. And let me just tell you, from my own personal experience, that if you think you can't fall, if you think you can't really falter, if you think that you can't walk away, you don't really understand how human nature works or the power of the forces aligned against us. Because we're all capable of things we don't even know we're capable of. And every weakness can and will be exploited, which is another reason why we need to be united together. We need to be firm together. We need to be serious together about this faith that we say is the most important thing in our lives. It begins with love. These Philippians have got that part down. But they need to realize that if they're going to be fruitful, if they're going to be successful, then they have to put first things first, because the only alternative to that is to be so caught up in what's out there and the things that the world has to offer There are people who get and forget, and there are people who give and forgive. And we definitely want to be in that second group. Know what matters. Live what matters. And we truly will be living, breathing expressions of Jesus himself.